You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator and your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor, your host, and today I'm going to have a chance to speak with my dear friend, Marc Morial, who is the former mayor of New Orleans and the longtime now president of the National Urban League. We're going to talk to Marc about his long and illustrious career, what motivated him to a career in life and service, and how he's doing in his role at the Urban League, and what are some of the main issues that the Urban League is dealing with as it works to improve the conditions and opportunities for African Americans in this country. Marc, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Hey, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks, Art, for having me today, and I look forward to a great discussion.
Well, Marc, I couldn't wait to get you on because I wanted to talk for a minute about generational generosity or generational public service. And your father was all about that. I mean, he was very involved in everything going on in New Orleans throughout his life, was mayor of the city. And I can't help but ask you, what was it like to grow up under someone like that? And how did that affect the man you became, who obviously is so into public service and giving?
Yeah, well, thank you, Art. And it's great to be able to reflect my late father, Ernest N. Morial, who died 32 years ago in 1989, very suddenly due to an asthma attack. But I grew up with a father and a mother. My mother, who is still with us, Sybil Morial, was a teacher, an educator, and a civic activist, and by my father's side in everything he did, but also forged her own tremendous reputation as an educator and civic activist. Two parents who I remember always being busy, always being on the go, always juggling multiple things, in a family of 5 children and a family that was a no-nonsense household where you did chores, you went to school, you went to church, and you really weren't going to create a lot of mess. My parents were strict in an old-fashioned kind of way, but not in a way that was abusive or draconian, right? They were of that generation because they were those that grew up with the experiences of the Great Depression, the experiences of segregation in the South, and they dedicated their lives to fighting to end it. My father is a lawyer and an NAACP civil rights activist, and later as an elected official. My mother as a teacher and union activist and a civic activist, creating, doing voter registration drives, and after the Voting Rights Act, and being the driving force behind the Black exhibit at the 1984 World's Fair. She has written a book. She was a producer of documentaries. My mother was a multitasker, just like my father. And I think the impact was infectious and contagious because the passion and the sense of purpose that they brought to their lives is what was instilled in me at a very young age. And also the impatience and distaste for injustice and unfair treatment, and a fundamental love for people and human beings, and also a deep, deep caring of the locked out and the left out in our community. And so that world shaped me. It shaped my brothers and sisters in very profound ways that we were not necessarily conscious of when all of those values are being injected into our DNA.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I asked that because I wonder if parents today can take some of that so that their children will come up with the same kinds of orientation to service and giving. Because what we're seeing, Mark, is that families are giving less to charitable organizations, both time and money. And I am very eager to find ways to reverse that. And I think if families could take clues from what they might learn from your family, that might be very valuable to them as they try to instill this in their own children and maybe in their own lives. You mentioned the word purpose. I happen to think it's so important that we all have some type of purpose in our lives. And that seems to drive everything else. All the rest of our lives seem to cascade from what we define as our purpose. So thank you for that. I met you, Mark. It seems like many years ago. Although I can remember it, it was like yesterday. I was in New Orleans at the invitation of our good friend, Philip Baptiste.
Oh,
Baptiste.
Philip Baptiste was one of my father's nearest and dearest friends, and a man of great passion.
He sure was.
And leader of Opportunities Industrialization Corporation, OIC.
Yep.
Just an incredible business person, community activist, and civic activist. And I remember Philip is still with us. I remember his contributions and his friendship with my father with great fondness.
Well, I'll tell you, Mark, there wasn't a time when Philip didn't call me on the phone and cuss me out about something. But I always
he cussed everybody out. It was his way of showing affection.
Exactly. And
to call you and cuss you out, you just sat and you listened.
That's exactly right. And I'll never forget one time he said, "All right, tell him, you got to get down here, man." So I did that. I came down, and it was a day, Mark, during your time in office when you gave this most amazing presentation on what you were doing to move housing opportunities forward in New Orleans. I don't know if you remember that, but it was I
may not remember specifically, but I remember the work we were doing in housing and housing redevelopment. New Orleans had a huge problem in the 90s, late 80s. We had, I remember the number to this day, 27,500 abandoned housing units. Because when the oil economy collapsed in the late 80s in southern Louisiana, we had an out-migration of people. They literally walked away from homes that were being foreclosed on. They walked away from properties that they were renting, and we were left with a tremendous, not only physical plight, but really a challenge to communities. And we had to stand up an effort to address that.
Well, you did, and it was quite remarkable how you delivered this program, this plan that you had to rehabilitate these homes and get people who were homeless into them, and what the city was going to do, and how you were pulling resources together from various places to make this happen. It was one of the most impressive presentations I've heard from a mayor, and you were quite young at the time. So this was not, some old guy who he had everything figured out. It was bold, it was aggressive, and it was focused on getting people what they needed at a time when there was not a whole lot of talk about this.
Art, I had the great opportunity to do some substantial things when I was a young man, including serve as mayor of my own hometown. But it produced a desire to bring more young people into government, which we did, as well as a desire to, as I would say, throw deep, innovate, push, try new things, not be wedded to yesterday's approach. And in the early days, some of the things we were proposing were risky. 3 to 5 years later, they paid enormous dividends. And I say to people, we were willing to take calculated risks, intelligent risks, but also to follow through and to bring resources together from private, public, and nonprofit streams and sectors to build an effort. And this is why I think it's so important that young people run for public office, that many that we've seen as activists in the communities and in the streets need to take the next step. Look, the civil rights generation, Dr. King's lieutenants, Julian Bond, John Lewis, Andrew Young, became elected officials. Hosea Williams became elected officials. My father, his friends who were civil rights lawyers like Israel Augustine, Revius, Ortiz, to name a few, they all became elected officials. My father became a legislator, a judge and an executive. Augustine became a judge. Ortiz became a judge and ultimately is the first Black Supreme Court justice in Louisiana. They took the next step, and there were many, many others. And we need younger people to offer themselves for public office. And yeah, there's so many ways to contribute. So I don't want to be in politics. You have to be in politics. Politics is democracy. Democracy is how we choose our leaders. Our leaders make decisions on where money is spent, where money is invested, what the policies are for children, for families, for taxes, for housing, for economic development. You can't surrender the elected sphere to others and think you're going to be a change agent. Elected office in and of itself, by itself and alone, doesn't create change, isn't the only engine of change, but it is an essential engine of change. We need those who choose to go inside of corporate America and climb the ladder and have impact there. We need those that are going to choose higher ed. We need those that are going to choose the nonprofit world as a place to be able to contribute. And we can't think that it is one avenue versus the other that can bring about the kind of social and economic change we want. You know, to your question, Art, about families and giving, I think one of the things that has occurred in the age of social media is that people are not tethered to organizations for collective action as they once were. You know, people would be involved in churches, neighborhood groups, civic associations, political clubs. And it was through those efforts that community improvement, community advocacy, change projects took place. So it was a way to organize people's ability to give back their time, give back their money. We're now in an age where we are friends with people because we're friends with them on Facebook. We're connected to people because they are Twitter followers of ours. We know people because I saw you on Instagram. And that is the real here and now. But the collective action, I say, it's not social media versus the way we did things in the past. It's plussing. It's a combination of the two. The utilization of social media as a tool to organize, to community engage, to register people to vote, to raise money for a good cause. There's so many ways and methods. And we need people to realize that you can't just send out 5 tweets and then go get a Starbucks latte and believe that, hey, I'm an activist. I put out 5 tweets.
I had impact.
You know, you have had an impact. I'm glad you sent those 5 purposeful tweets out, but you got to do more. We got to do more.
So, Mark, let's talk about you doing more. You were a politician, and probably in your heart you still are. And you had this opportunity come up to lead the National Urban League, which is one of the, if not the premier civil rights organization in the country. I'll just say it. And I wanted to talk to you about that transition. What was in your heart at the time when you made that move? And how has that worked out? How has it worked out for you? And how would you say it's worked out for the league?
So let's talk in candor and in truth. I was retired from elected office by this thing called term limits, and on the other hand, the glass ceiling. So, but for the glass ceiling in Louisiana politics, I have no doubt I would have become a candidate for governor or a candidate for the United States Senate. But Louisiana of that time and Louisiana of now, even today in 2021, no one African American has ever been elected statewide in the modern history of Louisiana since Reconstruction. So I made a judgment that the time wasn't right for me to take a shot at a statewide race. And I also didn't want to pretend to take a shot where I'd have to change my views on things, start modulating and justifying. Because if there's anything I've always tried to be, and that is authentic and real, candid about what I think. I want to live with myself and live with my own conscience all the time and be true to that. So joined a law firm coming out of City Hall and thought that I'd be there for a time until I just assessed other longer term options. And the National Urban League knocked on my door, invited me to apply and interview. And lo and behold, I was selected. Now, for me, the excitement of the National Urban League is that it was a national civil rights organization. It had been led by legends like Whitney Young and Vernon Jordan. I had grown up having met Vernon Jordan through family connections, followed him professionally through the pages of Jet magazine when I was in high school and college, and really revered the work of the National Urban League historically, and thought that it was an opportunity to take a historic brand that to some extent had become too quiet and not aggressive enough, and breathe new life in it and transform it and make it what I think it's on its way to becoming today. And so it was a chance to play on the national stage. Now, when I joined, I didn't expect that I would be there more than 5 to 10 years. But you fall in love with the people, the institution, the possibility of it being a great place to make a difference. And we make a difference. I spoke yesterday to Maxine Waters. I was part of a meeting last week with Joe Manchin, 2 months ago this summer with Joe Biden, Charles Schumer. We impact today with the CEO of one Fortune 500 company. We are connected with and engage with a range of influencers in this country because they know we have a community-based movement and that we speak not just for Marc Morial, but we speak for a broad-based coalition of people in this country focused on the African American community. And so that is what this opportunity has meant to me. And a chance, my work in New Orleans, I was elected to transform and change. It's why I ran. It was my purpose on day one. It was my purpose on the final day. In this job, same thing. My purpose was not to simply preside. It was to initiate change. And so the National Urban League is 4 times as large from a budgetary standpoint today than it was when I began. If you look at our online membership and our actively engaged, it's in the millions. If you look at the strength and the leadership of our affiliate networks, it's never been more impactful or effective. If you look at our events, our direct services programs, and look, we do what we do, and we're proud to do what we do. We are not in competition with any other civil rights organization. We're not in competition with any other nonprofit organization. We believe that we are sui generis. We're unique. We are one of a kind. We're a unicorn because we're civil rights mission driven, but we're a direct services organization. And we have our, if you will, relationship avenues into a lot of places. Business America, grassroots America, civil rights activists, the labor movement. We have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And when you're in a long-term institution, that's what this is about. These days, and historically, more with Democrats than we do with the GOP, but we are not a Democratic organization or Republican organization. We don't define or describe ourselves. We are a racial justice focused organization. We are a civil rights focused organization. And wherever that takes us is where we go.
Mark, so important that you mentioned the civil rights focus, because I would argue that we have a little bit of wind, in our sails right now with many of the activists out there. And I just wonder if that creates both opportunity, though, and also some challenges, because when you mention institution, movements aren't necessarily institutions, right? They're movements. We get progress out of them, but they're not necessarily there for the long haul. How have you been able to work with?
Movements are critical and crucial to the transformation of social change. Institutions are crucial as well, but institutions are also crucial on what I call the follow-up and the follow-through, on trying to orchestrate. So how do you take protest to policy change? So I've been involved this year in working to pass voting rights and democracy reform, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the For the People Act. We've been fighting for democracy. We've been fighting to take the energy around George Floyd into the Congress to pass a police reform bill. We have been working to bring to bear things that, like the child tax credit, like early childhood education, like support for housing and small businesses. All of that's wrapped up in the president's plan, right? So when we talk about the president's plan, this is the actualization of the commitments that we asked politicians to make when they ran. It's not some that fell out of heaven or fell from the sky. It is a blueprint that we said, Biden, we want a black agenda. Well, child tax credit, dealing with childhood poverty, early childhood education, paid family leave, down payment assistance. And I could go on and on and on, things that will benefit communities at large, but specifically also have a focus on Black America. And so we have to realize that history teaches us that legacy institutions and protest movements are not at odds with each other. They are part of a continuum of work. Many of our members were part of protest. I participated in a number of protests, even though that's not our central organizing strategy, right? But our work is when the protests subside and now commitments have been made, the follow through, the ideas. So this year we put blueprints together. We put a infrastructure and jobs blueprint together called the Main Street Marshall Plan. We shared it with Biden as candidate Biden. We shared it with Biden as President-elect Biden. We shared it with Biden and his team. And many of the things we included in our plan, which was a plan for Black America, are in the Biden plan. We put together a broadband plan called the Lewis-Latimer Plan, dealing with broadband and the digital divide. Those ideas have been operationalized to some extent in the infrastructure bill. We put together a 21 Pillars police reform plan. Much of that is in the George Floyd bill, but we're going even further, taking that set of policy prescriptions to local communities across the nation to have discussions around police reimagination and re-envisioning. So there's a whole lot of energy and work to make politicians live up to their commitments.
So let me ask you about corporate America, because certainly the work of the National Urban League and yours personally extends into corporate America. And we know that many corporations today are looking at how they're faring with concepts like diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And I'm just curious what you're seeing and how would you evaluate corporate America on a whole, and who's doing great work and who needs to improve, and how do they need to improve?
Yeah, I find it difficult to evaluate corporate America as a whole. Because if you do it as a whole, those that are not present are going to certainly detract from those who are working to be present. So I think, as always, there are a group of companies that are far more serious than others. They have diverse boards. They have diverse C-suites. They are diverse in how they do their philanthropy. They have a significant commitment to Black talent and also to Black supplier diversity. And then there are some that basically are doing nothing. Their boards are not diverse. Their C-suites are not diverse. Their philanthropy is not diverse. They're not there yet. We have to continue to push. There's 2,200, I believe, publicly traded companies in America. The largest employers of Black people after the federal government are 2 or 3 major corporations. We spend money with many of these companies. It stands to reason that they need to be more responsible towards and more focused on the types of things we're talking about today. So I think that we saw a lot of commitments last year, and I think we are beginning to get a clearer look on how many of these commitments were one-time commitments versus how many people are substantially committed to the long term.
Yeah. I know you're also interested in economic mobility, of course, of African Americans, and particularly entrepreneurship and how we might get more African Americans to become business owners. Do you have a sense that we're making progress there, and in terms of our ability to own and operate our own businesses? And are you seeing success there, and what might we do to make it even more successful?
We have a long way to go, Art, in that arena. We do have, I think, an uptick in those that want to be business people who are creating small businesses, 1, 2, 3 employees. I think we still have a big challenge in building businesses of substantial scale, which I think is really what you're talking about. This is very important and very difficult and very demanding. So I think that this is an incomplete. I don't think anyone can take credit. There's still capital constraints, connections, customers, lots of challenges. But, I always meet young African-American business people who I'm impressed with. I always meet people with startups. You see a lot of startups, businesses that may generate enough money to take care of one person or 2 people or one family. But we have to build scale. And to build scale, we have to unlock access to risk capital, venture capital, private equity, the kind of capital that is not a loan, doesn't burden you in debt. That is where great wealth has been built in this country, on the risk capital side, not by borrowing money, but someone who says, I see a little progress here, a little progress here, but it's not enough. It's a bucket in an ocean or a wash tub in an ocean, right? So if you look at the wash tub, you say, boy, that wash tub is filled. But when you pour it into the ocean. And so we have a lot of work to do in this arena, but this has to be central to the social justice agenda. Building institutions owned by Black people, partially owned by Black people, that can employ and produce generational wealth.
Tell me about the tech industry. I mean, we've heard a lot about how few African Americans seem to be able to break into Silicon Valley opportunities.
Silicon Valley is not diverse. That's a polite way to say it. You begin to see some progress. There are a handful of Black corporate executives, 1 or 2 CEOs of tech companies. You see some progress, small in that area. But in terms of companies in Silicon Valley, maybe that are owned by Black people and brown people, there may be more of them than can fit in a telephone booth, an old-fashioned telephone booth, but maybe not enough to fill a classroom. And I think that Silicon Valley is still stubborn in its understanding that they've got an obligation to lead on equity. They've got an obligation to lead on racial justice. They have to understand that they've built Silicon Valley in the last 25 years, fundamentally built it as an exclusive club.
So we have a few more minutes, and I have to ask you about education. And I want to conclude with looking at more informal ways of learning than college institutions, for instance, which may be in some cases coming to understand the importance of recruiting and matriculating African Americans. But clearly there are other types of learning and opportunities that maybe we need to expand on as well. What's your sense of how African Americans in particular are managing in our educational systems, and what do we need to do to strengthen that?
So pre-pandemic, our Black high school graduation rate had ticked up. Our college graduation rate had begun to tick up. But I fear we've lost some ground during the pandemic with kids not being able to go to school because they don't have the proper technology or relegated to connecting only through technology. I think that that's a factor. I also think young people today are so burdened by debt if they want to do a 2 or 4 year college that it begins to disincentivize the process where people rightfully make a judgment call. If I take on this debt, will the income I earn with the degree offset the debt, and will I be better off than if I didn't take the debt, right?
Yeah, that's a big question.
And that's the reality factor that we face.
Well, look, I know you have a lot going on.
All right, we're going to have to do this again. We're just getting started.
Yeah, obviously.
And I appreciate your friendship and leadership and the great memory of Philip Baptiste back in New Orleans, but appreciate those memories. Appreciate your tremendous career and all the work you do.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I appreciate you finding the time to join me today. And as you said, we will have opportunities to talk again. This is the Heart of Giving podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll listen to other episodes by just going to any of the major podcast platforms. You can also follow us and subscribe on Patreon if you want to make a donation, patreon.com. And also make a comment especially on Apple Podcasts. We would love to get a favorable review on Apple Podcasts because that helps us to build audience. Thank you very much.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.